Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to be doing a small mini book review on this novel called Maybe. It kind of got me out of my reading slump because I've been really feeling down and I guess in my emotions and a little bit depressed. If you saw my last book review, the thumbnail was accurate. I've been going through a lot of stuff mentally. And it mostly has to do with like career wise and job wise, and I want to do like a whole vlog talking about that stuff. Today I'm just going to do a small review on this book because it did get me out of my reading slump. I would like to do a video on reading slumps, but I feel like those ones are kind of really clickbaity and sometimes they don't always work for everybody, in my personal opinion. But yeah, so this novel, I think I did haul this in one of my videos. Got it at a book sale at a library by my college a while back, and I thought it was a poetry book. I don't know why I thought it was a poetry book, maybe because of the title. It's called Maybe by Brent Runyon. I cannot pronounce the name. And apparently, I think they wrote two other books, and this book came out in, I believe, the early 2000s. I can double check. Yeah, like 2006, 2007-ish. And I think it was mostly the back that just made me feel like it was a poetry book, even though it's not. I saw a lot of Goodreads reviews on this and they weren't good. I have some thoughts on it, even though this is gonna be a small, short book review. A quick synopsis of it is about a boy named Brian. You are reading through the perspective of an adolescent teenager. Emphasis on adolescent boy teenager. And the book does a good job of doing that, okay? And I don't want to offend anybody because this book is kind of offensive, and I know this book is not going to be for everyone. And so basically you're just going through this kid's life who suffered a very traumatic incident where they lost their older brother, and they're just trying to navigate moving to a new high school and finding out who they are as a person through relationships, being like a stereotypical boy relationship mindset, and peer pressure and wanting to fit into like societal norms in an interesting way, and also navigating their own personal emotions. This book feels kind of sexist in a weird way. Even though it was written by a guy, it does feel very like this is stereotyped of what a adolescent boy's mindset is on relationships and emotions and expressing stuff. But I think it does a good job of doing that, even though it's a huge stereotype. And I get that that might offend some people. This book is kind of a product of the era that it came out in, like very heavily, because there are a lot of like, it's weird because there are usages of terms like hippie used a lot in this book, but then like, and that kind of feels like it's a product of its time. But at the same time too, there are some other words that are kind of like, I don't feel like 2000s high school students would say these things. That sounds more like a like boomer type of saying. I don't know why. It just sounds a little bit odd sometimes. But yeah, I mean, it's not a bad book. I gave it a 4-star review on Goodreads. I wanted to give it a 3.5. I cannot do that, but I would give it a 3.5 star. Just because I kind of, even though I am not a guy, I did relate to some of the stuff that was talked about in this book, mostly about losing someone, and we'll get into that later, and like how you deal with it. Like kind of like, it's not a great depiction of grief and the stages of grief, but it's kind of close to it. But everybody's personal experience is different. But yeah, I mean, and then that's my small little snippet of it. The book, the ending is pretty good. If you are going to read this, just be aware that the beginning is very offensive. And I think that's the point, because when you get like maybe like a third of the way in, it starts to not be as offensive, which is interesting, because the weird thing about this book is that it kind of feels like it was written by 2 different people, maybe 3 different people. Because the beginning feels very offensive and very like stereotyped, very juvenile, very like, this is what a book should be of this kind of genre kind of feeling. It's really weird. And then when you make it a third of the way in, then it starts to lose that feeling. And then towards the end, it's like, wow, this feels more mature and adult-ish than I thought it would. But it's more towards the end of it. And some people have said that like, oh, well, like I couldn't really get to know the character in the beginning because they were a sexist asshole who was a juvenile boy. And at that point, that was like the first couple of chapters, and instantly like you don't want to read anymore because you're kind of just like, this offends me and I don't want to go on this journey. Some people were like, why was this book ever written? And I kind of get why it was. But I mean, the middle part and the ending aren't that bad. I just do feel like it was written by different people because, and I kind of feel like maybe that was the point of the beginning, to be very offensive and be very like attention grabbing. If you've ever taken like an English class, you're told that, hey, if you cannot get somebody's attention in the first like couple of chapters or even in the first line, then you've lost people. And like one of the first like sentences in this book is like the first couple of chapters are like really offensive just because they're very sexist. There are, I would assume, like some like stereotypes of like men and women in here along. I wouldn't say that there are any like racist forms in here, but I feel like that was the point that it was going across. I'm not trying to defend the book by any means. I don't want to defend it, but I kind of get the feeling that the reason why the first couple of chapters or the first beginning of this book is the way that it is because it's supposed to be like a young adolescent boy who is trying to figure out who they are as a person. So like the first, like it's kind of almost like when you interact with somebody, you don't really know them and their first impression can be really off-putting, but once you start to get to know them, then it starts to like get a little bit better. That's kind of how this book is. It's like a person. It's like a person that you find very offensive, but once you start to get to know them, you start to realize, oh, so that's the reason why you are the way that you are. It doesn't necessarily mean that I like you or not. I just understand who you are as a person now. That's kind of how this book is, which is an interesting like way of thinking of it. Anyway, I'm gonna just grab my cup of coffee. If you can tell, I'm feeling very interesting today. So I did have a couple of notes on this book. This book kind of makes you eye roll at a lot of things. It's very offensive in the beginning, I will say that. Some of the things that I found interesting about it was the reason why I kind of enjoyed this book. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to defend this book because this book was kind of offensive towards me, and that's why I could have read this book in a day and a half, but I didn't. I read it over the course of 3 days because there were certain parts of it that just like kind of I had to stop reading. And sometimes it's good to stop reading something that you're kind of like, ooh. I found it offensive in the sense that like I didn't like the fact that the character was constantly wanting a sexual relationship because they were a virgin, and that was like their end all be all goal. And then when they finally got it, it was heartbreaking for them, and they did end up finding like a real relationship by the end of it, but I didn't like that was like a goal for the character. And I would like to hope that like not every adolescent boy is like that, but I don't know if I'm right about that. But then if I say that I don't think that's true, then I will be seen as a sexist person. It's just that this book kind of like depicts that. It's also offensive to girls in general because the girls are kind of depicted as either like stoners or hippies or weird feminists who don't want to shave and or who are just like seen as objects kind of in a way because the main character just wants to hook up with them pretty much until they find like one character that's like, oh, for me. But then at that point it's kind of like, are you actually wanting this relationship? Because there were certain characters that this character was dating, and when they first dated them they were like, oh, but I get this feeling when I'm around them and this and this and this, and I really enjoy them and I think they're really cute. But then once they got close to what they wanted, they kind of were like, I don't really like this person anymore. So it's like, are you gonna do that again with the new character, because you're saying the same things but not necessarily like doing anything different about it. Anyway, the things that I liked about this book were the fact of like the metaphors that were kind of like subliminal, because this book does talk about losing someone, and it kind of hit home a little bit with me because I lost somebody who was in a car accident, and they lost somebody. It was their older brother that they lost, who was out drinking at a party, and then drove, did not have their headlights, their car did not have working airbags, and they weren't wearing their seatbelt, and they got into a car accident. They fell into like a ditch area and they ended up dying. This book takes place a year after that happens, and the signs of depression are interesting because I've experienced this. A little background story for me: I lost somebody who was really, really close to me in a car accident, and I didn't know a lot of the details as to what happened. This character knows some of the details as to what happened to their brother, but they kind of bring up the fact of like, I don't, like, why did it happen? Did you do it on purpose? Like all these questions that go through your head, those questions have gone through my head too, where I was like, did you do this on purpose? Like, you could have stayed home, you could have stayed with a friend, you didn't have to come so late, you could have done this, you could have done that, why didn't you call, why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that? And it's a lot of that. And I related to that on a personal level, and it's also because like I used to really love cars when I was younger. I used to drive in them all the time, and like the motion of it would make me fall asleep a lot, and I enjoyed the feeling of being driven around. This character talks about how like there's one scene where like there are these particular scenes where it goes into depth about like, oh, these great feelings, and then it doesn't feel like a teenager's mind anymore. It feels more like, this is what I'm like wanting in this book. So talking about like, oh, well, like I'm driving and like I'm speeding and doing this, and I enjoy driving and all of that stuff. And like that's kind of like my mentality of how I used to enjoy cars, and now I don't, because I do have a little bit form of PTSD, even though the accident didn't happen to me. Seeing the images of what happened and being told of what possibly could have happened and how the story kept changing, like that kind of stuff gives me anxiety, because I have anxiety in general. So when I drive like an hour and a half to work, I get very, very terrified. Like I recently actually had like a small car accident where like I was driving through like a construction area on the highway, and my tire popped, and it scared the crap out of me because it was early in the morning. I was driving to work, and instantly I kept thinking like, do I stay in the car? Do I not stay in the car? Because I was like on the left shoulder and people were speeding really, really quickly. So I was like freaking out. I didn't really know what to do. And I couldn't change the tire because the tire was on the side of where the cars were coming. So having those feelings of like that kind of stuff, and also having negative thoughts in that moment where I was just like, well, this is how I die. Maybe I should just like go for it. And those conversations happen in this book where like the character is like, should I keep speeding? Should I do what my brother did? Should I like do all this other stuff? Which is kind of relatable. I mean, like I've been going through like similar experiences. Granted, it's been like maybe 10 years now, and like depression, well, not depression, but the feeling of losing somebody never goes away. Like that thought process never really goes away. You constantly think, especially if the person was really heavily involved in your life, like mine was, like certain momentous occasions that happen, you're kind of just like, wow, this person isn't here. Like one instance is where he's talking about how it'll have been 1 year since his brother died, and he's going to be older than his brother now, which that thought process occurs to me like pretty often, where I'm like, wow, this person wasn't here for my graduation, this person wasn't here for me going away to college, you know, like all of these things. And I'm not looking forward to the day when I'm like older than this person, because that just feels really wrong and feels really weird. And things like that, like you relate to in novels like these. The other things that I enjoyed were just like the symbolism of like how it's been a year for them. They're going through this grieving process of like because I guess it's kind of like a stereotype that like guys don't express emotion, and this particular character, he doesn't cry, he doesn't feel like he can cry because he hasn't been able to cry since, and they keep bottling it up, and every time they go through their things, like, it just explodes. And I do that a lot too. I'm not a huge crier, like I can't cry in front of people. And like another good example of this is like, you know, like bottling up your emotions. I try not to do it as much as I used to. I used to really bottle it up a lot. And I hate to say that, like, you know, pushing it away and forgetting about it. But I mean, like, sometimes you unintentionally do that. Like, you go into this state of mind of survival mode and you just forget about it. It's not a good thing, but I mean, like, sometimes that happens. But anyway, so one moment of what this character does is they finally hook up with someone who they really care about, and they tell this person like their emotions and feelings. And I guess I should give like a backstory. So they move to a new town, and they don't have a good relationship with their parents anymore because their parents, you know, lost a son, and they probably see their son in him, and they just don't really talk. They don't really have good conversations. And I mean, I've kind of experienced that a little bit, where it's like really awkward to talk to people, especially when you see like the person that you lost in them, and it's really hard to talk to them, and that kind of stuff. And so this character ends up joining a theater group in their school, which I wouldn't have guessed that this person wanted to be a theater kid. Does not give off that vibe, which is kind of interesting. And so they ended up getting like rushed into being a thespian, which is like just basically for him to be able to eat in the theater. And so they're basically initiated, and it's really odd, that moment. And so they befriend one of the theater kids who is named Dan. And Dan, they see this character as a like older brother type figure, so I can kind of understand why they appreciated this character. But this character also kind of peer pressured them a lot to do things and like hurt their feelings and whatnot, because Dan got into a relationship with this girl named Amy, and then ended up cheating on her, and that was like a whole thing, to which the main character Brian ends up hooking up with Amy. And so like that is a whole thing, and that's a whole huge issue because Brian sees Dan as like an older brother figure, and to see Dan hurt him in that way is kind of like reminiscent of his own brother and his own issues that he has to like deal with and go through. And I kind of feel like I can kind of relate to that, because like when you lose somebody who's really, really close to you, sometimes you try to look for other people who are very, very similar like them and try to like befriend them and get them to be the replacement of what you lost. And that is like a never gonna happen type of scenario. And I'm trying to get over that because I'm never gonna be able to find somebody to replace them. And I don't think we should do that. But anyway, so what ends up happening is one instance of like not being able to cry, because like I do that a lot too. And one thing that I related in this book was where Brian, the main character, ends up hooking up with Amy. He ends up like gushing about what happened about his brother because he had never told anybody, and it's been a year, and he's crying about it, and he's like finally crying about it and like letting out all these emotions. And it's interesting because, well, she ends up leaving him because she's in love with like the cheater, and that's a whole thing which I just did not enjoy in general, but I understood at the same time because like she was a virgin, and that's the reason why she thinks she's in love with this other guy. And like I'm pretty sure a lot of people have been through that experience. But anyway, it doesn't paint the side characters in a very good light. That's one of those things too, because it's like from the perspective of somebody who's going through issues mentally and seeing everybody else as these like horrible, horrible people, even though they're not actually bad people. They're just, you know, going through their own experiences as well. But anyway, so he talks about how like he's gushing to her about like all these emotions that he's having, and it's like a freaking waterfall and all this stuff. And then he ends up doing the same thing with another girl later on. but he talks about how that experience felt more like a steady stream. And I'm like, I relate to that because I've had moments where like I'd never really cry in front of people, and for some weird reason sometimes I like just break down completely and like waterfalls happen because to a complete like stranger, and not like a complete stranger, but like to people who like don't really matter in my life, and I'll just like completely break down. And I don't know if it's like that's more of like an emotion of, well, this person doesn't matter to me in my life, so it doesn't matter if I break down to them or not, because that's happened to me like more than one occasion. So that's what I enjoyed in this book, was like this kind of depiction of like not being able to like express yourself emotionally and then taking it out on, you know, relationships that you shouldn't be taking it out on, which I can relate to. Like I've done that before, where like I've like kind of in a way, like the reason why I get the stereotype thing is that I've done that before too, where like if I was in a relationship and like say any relationship where like I was talking a lot and then all of a sudden they ghosted me, and then like I get into a new relationship and then I bring up, oh well, like I've been ghosted a lot in the past and whatever, and I feel like I'm never gonna find a relationship because, you know, people, guys or whatever, are like that all the time. And like some guys will say like, oh, but not every guy is like that, like don't stereotype me. And that's why I kind of get some of the stereotypes in this book, is because when you go through a traumatic instance like this character did, you kind of project that onto everybody else. So you just assume, well, everybody's like this, then everybody's going to be the same way because this person did it to me, and therefore everyone is against me. And I kind of have experienced that in my personal experience, so that's where I relate to that, and I appreciate the way that like the emotions are depicted. What do you call it? And then also there was a depiction, there was a few moments where like they're talking about God and like if God exists and whatnot. I'm not a huge religious person. I've heard people say that like when you lose somebody, either you become very, very religious or you go the opposite direction. And I went the opposite direction. And like that conversation did come up in this book, where it was like, if there was a God, why would they do this to this person? They just didn't care about me. They didn't care about them living and whatnot. And like that has crossed my mind multiple times throughout my life. And I understand the point of religion. I just don't believe in a lot of it. But I do appreciate the depiction of how this character goes through their emotions and then finally ends up opening up to people. Like they finally end up opening up to their parents, like not verbally, but like physically. Like they like switch up the way that they do their eating at the dinner table, and they start like, you know, hanging out with their parents. And then other instances of like them not hanging out with like the people who basically initiated them into a theater group, and then going into a different route of like the character really enjoyed music throughout the novel, like talking about like 80s and 90s bands like Nine Inch Nails and the Beatles and stuff like that, and then going into a different route of like, hey, like this crowd seems more interesting and whatnot. So I thought that that was a good depiction of it. Also, what do you call it? I felt like it was a really good depiction of like what not a boy's mind is, but just like any teenager's mind, where like certain parts of it are like very like repetitive, like these are my thoughts, like consistently thinking this over and over and over again, like being kind of compulsive in a way. And I felt like this I kind of enjoy because it feels a little bit more immersive. It's a little bit jarring at first when you're like just hearing somebody's thoughts, but it feels a little bit more immersive the more you start reading it, when they're repeating things over and over and over again, where it doesn't make sense, but you kind of realize that this is a person's mind, either because there are a few moments where they're drinking, or they're just having like depressive thoughts, or questioning the meaning of life, like God and stuff like that. So like having those thoughts consistently over and over and over again, it kind of makes you feel a little bit more like I am in somebody else's head and I'm not just reading a book, which I thoroughly enjoyed that. What do you call it? But yeah, no, I think the parts that this book really thrives on are the parts where it's subtle on like what happened to the brother, because they don't like flat out say what happened to the brother. They just like mention here and there, which I appreciate, because like it does feel like you're reading somebody's like person, like who they are as a person, because like when somebody goes through a traumatic instance, a lot of times they will not tell you like exactly what happened in their life. They're not going to just like gush all of it out to you instantly. It's more of like little tidbits here and there, and then you start to figure it out as you go along. That's how the traumatic instances in this book happen. I wish that there were more of it, because I feel like it was a little bit too on the nose here and there, but I feel like I wish that there was more of it, rather than like the constant bringing up of like, oh, I want to hook up with somebody, oh, I want to do this, oh, I want to drink, oh, I want to do this kind of stuff. Because it feels like that's more like societal stuff, that's like peer pressure, like them being initiated into like this theater group and whatever. And the only positive about the theater thing was the fact that they did end up like becoming a character in one of the plays. And they talked about sign language and like being able to sign and learn how to do that. There's a little bit of a conversation of how people who are deaf don't get treated the same way, but it's not very huge in the story. And that's why I'm kind of like, I don't feel like the theater aspect of the book, of the character being involved in the theater, really was that important, because it felt more like a setting to where conflict ends up happening later on, because the play wasn't really like talked about a lot. Like it was a few times and not that much, and the sign language stuff was a few times but not that much. And I kind of feel like it was more of just like a setting for just conflict to happen between him and his older brother figure Dan, and the relationship with Amy and stuff like that. So that kind of felt a little bit like forced here and there. I did enjoy the ending part though, because it was really cute seeing like an actual like relationship kind of blossom between him and another character. I forgot what her name was, and she's like a singer, and they met in like a chorus class, and she pretty much is just like a nice chill person. They end up going on a little date together. They have something in common, which is music, but they also disagree on it, so that's kind of interesting to know that, you know, like you can have common interests, but you can also disagree on certain things, which is, I enjoyed that, as long as you have like a good argument for it. And then they hang out on the beach and they just do like some cool chill stuff, which is nice and sweet, and to the point where it's like it feels like a progression of the character. And then the character finally goes and visits their brother's grave, which is interesting, because like there are a few moments where I appreciate the fact that the book goes to show that he does visit his brother's grave, he does go through his brother's things, but it's really hard for him to do that. And it is very, very hard for you to go through somebody's stuff, because it's like a whole endeavor of a day, because your day can really get ruined for the rest of it. And I don't like the idea of like the character just letting it go, because you can't let that stuff go. You can't let it define you either, but at the same time too, you have to like acknowledge that it exists and realize that it happened, and not push it away, which is a nice little message. And I appreciate that by the end of it, the character says, I finally feel everything, which is nice to know, because like that kind of just shows that the whole entire book, most of it, this character was going through a depressive state in their life, and then finally started to find out who they really were as a person, and like make their own choices and their own life decisions, and not hang around with horrible, crappy people, and be an actual like decent human being who can finally feel emotions and not just do things for others or for themselves, but do like a combination of the two. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I don't want to defend this book, because I do think that this book is a little bit offensive to people. Just an FYI, there is sexism in here, there's a bit of profanity. It is a little bit offensive in the beginning. I don't hate this book. I don't think it's a bad book by any means. I'm pretty sure I've read worse books than this. But it's not a bad book, and I did enjoy it. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. I've been going through some emotional feelings similarly to this, just because of recently, and through day-to-day stuff. And I think it got me out of my reading slump because I felt like I was kind of seen as a human being through a book. And I don't read a lot of books that like talk about, you know, depression and experiencing trauma like this, more realistic than fantasy stuff. And I kind of just felt like, you know, this is a nice little stepping stone into that kind of genre. And it was really short. That's the reason why I read it, and I own it. I think I am going to keep the book, even though I don't know if I'm going to read it again. I mean, it was a really quick read. It wasn't like the worst thing in the world. It's a little bit weird. It's an interesting book in the sense of like, wow, this book exists. And I'm a little bit offended, but I can kind of see where I was going with it. You know, I wouldn't say like this is like the worst book in the world. It's not. But yeah, I hope that was a nice review because my thoughts were all over the place and I'm a little bit tired. So yeah. But thank you guys. Oh, but if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. I try to post every Sunday at 11 a.m. I'm not sure if I'm going to change that yet or not. Leave a comment telling me if you ever went through like a traumatic experience, if you want to talk about that. What are your thoughts on this book if you've ever read it, and any experiences you've had similarly to this, I guess. Or you can just leave a like or a heart down below if you've ever had your heart broken, or if, you know, you've experienced like similar experiences, because I know I've been going through it a lot lately and it's been a bit of a journey. I kind of want to read a book that's a little bit more of a pick-me-up, but this was a good book to get me out of a reading slump, which some people might not agree with me, but I felt like I could relate to this book. Anyway, so yeah, that's the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah, so that's the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see all you guys in the next video. Bye. But yeah, my final thoughts on this book is that if you are interested in it, it's a maybe book. I mean, it pretty much is. Like, the title was perfect for it. It's a maybe. It's not a definite, it's a maybe. And that word is used pretty often to describe the character's feelings. And then finally they stick to their guns by the end of it. But yeah, this is a maybe book. It's not for everybody. It's not the best, but it's not the worst either. So it's a maybe. It's a decent book. Not profanity wise though. No. So yeah.
What the trouble with love is. What the trouble with love.